Can my buyer cancel because they found another property? The simple answer to this is no. There is no clause in the contract that says, hey buyer, if you find another property while you're under contract with this buyer, you can cancel the transaction. We have to remember the 4 categories of contingencies, basically cancellation reasons of why a buyer can cancel: due to the investigation, due to the appraisal, due to the sale of the buyer's property, or the loan contingency. Now, if you're weak into escrow and you just did your inspection and the buyer wants to open escrow with another property and use the investigation contingency to cancel the transaction so they can move to another property,
you're a thin ice, buddy.
In theory, yeah, but you are dancing a fine line. Just make sure you have your ducks in a row if that is the route that you're going. Can a buyer cancel because they changed their mind?
So, Cyrus, we got a little mind changer.
Going back to my previous answer, no, there is no mind changer clause in the contract that says, oh, hey, we're 21 days in this transaction and you know what? I changed my mind. I don't want to buy a home at all. No, there is no clause in the contract that says that. 4 contingencies of categories, and those are the only reasons your buyer can cancel. It must be for one of those contractual reasons. Is it risky to reduce the time frames of the contingencies?
Yes, it is.
Yes, it is absolutely risky to reduce the time frames because your client is allowed a certain period of time and you're reducing that time frame. Now, in an ultra-competitive market, it is common practice to remove those contingencies or to be countered by the seller to reduce those time frames, but that's a conversation that you have to have with your client and your lender to make sure that you can adhere towards those time frames and make sure that you can explain that to your client and inform them of the action that's about to take place. What happens if the contingencies are not removed on time?
Unacceptable!
When contingencies are not removed on time, that's never acceptable, but it does happen. Either party, the buyer or the seller, can request the time to be extended. And the way that this would be done is by using CAR Form ETA, Extension of Time Addendum. Complete the top section of the form. If you're requesting to extend a specific contingency, that would be completed in Section 2. The person requesting the extension would sign the bottom and send it to the other party. What happens if the other party doesn't want to agree to the extension? Easy. You can issue a notice of buyer to perform or notice a seller to perform and cancel the transaction. Can the transaction still close if the contingencies are not removed in writing?
It's all good, brother.
Yes, the transaction can still close if the contingency removals are not received in writing. However, best practice, whether you're representing the buyer or the seller, you do want to get these removed in writing, but essentially the transaction can close even if no contingency removals are completed. Can my client remove only certain contingencies? Absolutely. Using CAR Form CR, contingency removal, in Section 2, this is the section where the buyer can remove specific portions of that contingency and not remove all of them. We're 14 days into our transaction and my buyer still hasn't received the HOA documents yet. Do we have to remove the investigation contingency?
That's a complicated question.
The answer to this depends on a few things. Let's just assume that the investigation time frame is actually 17 days and on day 14 you still have not received the HOA documents. On day 17, the buyer may be asked and required to remove the physical inspection portion of the buyer investigation, or maybe the reports section of the investigation. However, the buyer is not going to be obligated or required to remove the condominium plan development HOA contingency. Adding a little extra to that, let's just say that the HOA documents were received on day 17. The buyer is still not required to remove that applicable contingency because the contract states that the buyer will have 5 days from receipt to review the applicable information.
Don't rush me. Don't rush me.
So bottom line is, if you're on day 17, day 20, and you just received those documents, you're allowed 5 days to review those documents before you will be required to remove the applicable contingency. My buyer doesn't really want to remove the appraisal contingency. Can we just make the offer with no appraisal contingency, do the appraisal right away, and if it doesn't appraise at value, we can cancel for another reason like the loan or the investigation?
I am very, very sneaky, sir.
Something no one has thought of. Something crazy.
Easy answer to this is no. Review your purchase agreement, review Section 8A1 and Section 8B1. Both of these statements and paragraphs protect the seller against this exact situation. Yes, we're trying to be sneaky and say, oh, hey, let's do no appraisal contingency, do it right away. And if it comes in low, we'll basically lie and say we're gonna cancel because of any other reason. You're playing with fire. The seller doesn't have to agree to this cancellation. Your buyer could lose money. Don't do it. If the seller has to find a replacement property in order to sell, when does my buyer's investigation, loan, and appraisal contingency timeframe start? Also, when is my buyer required to send in their initial deposit to escrow?
That's a great question.
This is a really good question, and in order to answer this question, you need to review the SPRP form, which is the seller's purchase of a replacement property. In section 2, it's going to discuss the time periods, it's going to discuss the buyer's deposit. To simplify it, nothing starts until the seller has submitted a written notice stating that they have found their replacement property. So basically no time frame start until the seller has found their replacement property. It's been 17 days since our offer was accepted. What if the seller has trouble finding a replacement property? What can the buyer do?
Not a damn thing.
Easy answer, nothing. The buyer willingly entered into this agreement knowing that the sale was contingent upon the seller finding a replacement property. If the seller doesn't find a property, the seller doesn't have to sell their property. The buyer then can't buy their property. It's been 30 days since my buyer's offer was accepted and we're ready to close the loan. We even have the rate lock about to expire. But the seller still hasn't found a replacement property. What can the buyer do?
Not a damn thing.
Can only wait helplessly.
Again, nothing. Unless the seller has identified the replacement property in writing, no time frames are starting, and they are still not obligated to complete this transaction of selling their home unless they have removed their applicable selling contingency.